They laughed when Silas Bowen started digging. Not behind his back. No, the people of Harrow Creek were never that subtle. They laughed from the road, from truck windows, from across the fence line where Gordon Marsh used to stand and shake his head like a man watching something painful. They laughed the way small towns laugh at things they don't understand, which is to say, loudly and without shame. Silas didn't stop digging. He was 64 years old that spring, with hands that had done harder things than push a post-hole digger into frozen ground, and a back that complained every morning at 5, but always showed up anyway. He'd come back to Harrow Creek 3 years earlier, after 31 years with the Canadian Forces, 2 tours in Bosnia, 1 in Afghanistan, a dozen years of things he didn't have names for anymore. He'd come back to the property his father had left him, 40 acres of rocky Manitoba land, a farmhouse that needed everything, and a well that had been dry since 2019. His daughter, Natalie, had asked him once why he chose to come back here of all places. He'd thought about it for a long time before answering. Because it's the only place left that's still mine, he'd said. Natalie hadn't pushed. She understood him better than most. The dog had come to him the second winter. A gray-muzzled shepherd cross, half wild and entirely starved, showed up at the back step during a storm, so bad the hydro lines went down for 11 days. Silas had opened the door to bring in more firewood and found the dog just sitting there in the blowing snow, looking up at him with the particular patience of an animal that has learned not to expect much from the world. He'd brought the dog inside. The dog had never left. Silas named him Pike. For the fish, not for anything ceremonial. Pike had a habit of sitting beside whatever Silas was working on, and watching with an expression of concentrated concern, as though he alone understood the weight of the project and wished to offer moral support. When Silas woke at 3 in the morning, breath short and chest tight, from some dream that never fully surfaced, Pike was already there, nose pressed to his forearm, warm and certain. That was enough most mornings. The digging had started in April, when the ground finally softened enough. Silas had spent the entire winter planning it. Sketches on graph paper spread across the kitchen table, library books on hydrology and soil permeability, a used copy of a manual on rural water systems he'd found at a sale in Portage-la-Prairie. He'd consulted with a retired hydrologist he found through the Provincial Agriculture Extension Office, a woman named Sandra who drove out from Winnipeg twice and walked his land with a water-witching rod she called. Completely unscientific but never wrong. Sandra had shown him where to dig. The neighbors had shown him what they thought of the idea. "You're going to hit rock 20 feet down," said the man who owned the cattle operation next door, a broad, sun-weathered rancher named Clifton Dwyer, who had opinions about everything and facts about nothing. "My grandfather dug out here." "Nothing. Your grandfather dug over there," Silas said, pointing northwest. "I'm digging here." Clifton Dwyer had made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough, and driven back down the road. The crew from the equipment rental in Brandon thought it was funny too. Not the project exactly, but the scale of it. Silas wasn't just drilling a well. He was building a collection system, buried cisterns, surface channels, a spring-fed catchment running 200 meters along the natural slope of the land. He'd calculated the average annual rainfall, the snow melt figures, the evaporation rates. He'd done the math a dozen times and then done it again. "You know they sell water delivery out here," said one of the rental crew, a young man with his cap on backwards and the easy confidence of someone who had never gone without water. "Trucked right to your tank. $100 a load." "I know," said Silas. "So why all this?" Silas looked at the young man for a moment. Pike sat beside him, ears forward, studying the conversation. "Because I'd like to be ready," Silas said. He wasn't sure the young man understood. Most people didn't yet. "Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today?" The spring Silas had chosen wasn't much to look at. A seep, really. Water pressing up through clay and gravel at the base of a long, slow ridge that ran along the eastern edge of his property. In a wet year you could see it. In a dry year it disappeared entirely, leaving only a dark stain on the earth where the moisture had been. The neighbors who'd been watching his land for 3 years while it sat vacant after his father's death had assumed the spring was gone for good. Sandra, the hydrologist, had told him otherwise. That spring is connected to something much deeper, she'd said, crouching at the seep with a jar, holding the water up to the light. Whatever's feeding it has been feeding it for a very long time. It ran dry at the surface because the pressure dropped. Drought years, lowered water table. But the source is still there. She'd looked at him over her glasses. You just have to give it somewhere to go. That was the thing about water Silas had learned. It didn't disappear. It moved. It found new paths, went underground, waited. Water was patient in a way that most living things weren't. You could mistake its patience for absence. You could walk past the same dry creek bed for 10 years and think, gone. But it wasn't gone. It was beneath you the whole time, finding its way. He thought about that a lot while he was digging. Pike thought about squirrels, mostly, but that was all right. The cisterns went in through May and June. 3 of them, precast concrete, buried at intervals along the slope. A buried collection channel, lined in drain tile, ran from the spring seep to the first cistern. Gravity would do the rest, moving water down from tank to tank, with a hand pump at the lowest point near the farmhouse. He'd also built a roof collection system on the barn, running gutters into a 4th above-ground tank, screened and sealed against debris. Natalie came out in July with her husband, Marcus, and their 2 kids, a boy of 9 named Felix, and a girl of 6 named Rosie, who immediately disappeared into the tall grass with Pike and did not reappear for 45 minutes. Marcus stood at the edge of the dig site, looking at the buried channels, the cisterns, the careful slope of the collection system, and said nothing for a long time. "Dad," Natalie said quietly, "this is incredible. It's practical," Silas said. "It's both," she said. Marcus asked good questions. He was an engineer, and he understood what he was looking at. He helped Silas seal a fitting on the second cistern that had been worrying him. And they worked together for 2 hours in comfortable silence while Natalie read on the porch, and the children ran themselves senseless in the field with the dog. That evening, Natalie found Silas on the back step after dinner looking out at the ridge. "Are you okay out here?" she asked. Not concerned exactly, more like checking. She had learned not to hover. "Better than I've been in a long time," he said. She sat down beside him. Pike came and lay across both their feet, which made it hard to move, but neither of them minded. "The Dwyer boy came by when we were unloading the car," Marcus said from the doorway. "Said to tell you the new cistern line runs too close to his fence." Silas nodded. "It doesn't," he said. "I surveyed it twice." Marcus smiled. "That's what I figured. The summer was dry. That wasn't unusual for southwestern Manitoba. Dry summers happened. But this one had a different character. A persistence that the old-timers in town started calling biblical by the middle of August, which was the word they used when they meant it, but didn't want to say the other word, crisis. The Assiniboine was low. The dugouts were low. The pastures went from green to khaki to something closer to bone, and the cattle operations started hauling water by late July because the natural sources had given out. The water trucks that the young rental crew had mentioned, the ones that made the whole project seem like overkill, were booked 3 weeks out. Silas's collection system had been filling since May. By August, the 3 buried cisterns held a combined 83,000 liters. The barn tank held another 12. The spring seep, channeled and protected, was still running, slower than spring, but running. He'd tested the water in June, clean, cold, with a mineral clarity that Sandra had described as very good news. Pike drank from the overflow outlet every morning and seemed satisfied. Silas was watering his garden, his small herd of 12 beef cattle, and his own household with almost no strain on the system. He'd planted a cover crop in May that was holding the soil together while everything around it cracked and curled. It was Natalie who called him in the second week of August. "Dad, is your water holding?" "Yes." A pause. He could hear Marcus in the background talking to someone. The Dwyer's cattle are in trouble. Clifton's been trucking water from Brandon, but the roads started getting soft in the heat, and the last delivery was late by 4 days. He's got 40 head that need water. Silas was quiet for a moment. How many are sick? 3, I think. Not bad yet. He looked out the window. The ridge was golden brown in the afternoon light. His cover crop was green. The overflow channel he'd built, the one Clifton Dwyer had told him ran too close to the fence, ran directly alongside the property line. "Tell Marcus to call Clifton," he said. "I can run a line from my overflow outlet to their south dugout. It won't fill it, nothing's going to fill it. But it'll keep the cattle drinking." Another pause. "Dad, he laughed at you for 6 months. I know that. He told people at the co-op that you were losing it, that the army had done something to your head." Silas looked at Pike, who was sitting by the back door, watching him with that expression of concentrated, patient concern. "The cattle didn't do anything to me," Silas said. He drove over the next morning with 100 meters of flexible irrigation hose, a handful of fittings, and Pike riding shotgun with his head out the window. Clifton Dwyer met him at the gate. The man looked older than Silas remembered. Not in years, but in the way that worry ages a person fast. He stood with his hat in his hands, which told Silas everything he needed to know about what the last few weeks had cost him. "I said some things," Clifton said, before Silas had even gotten out of the truck. "I know. They were foolish things. Yes, I'm not a man who—" Clifton stopped. Started again. "I'm not usually a man who asks for help." "Me neither," Silas said. "We probably both came by that honestly." Clifton's expression shifted. Something eased in it. They shook hands. Pike jumped down from the truck and immediately began inspecting the fence line with enormous professional interest. It took 3 hours to run the line, gravity-fed, from Silas's overflow outlet down to the Dwyer dugout. The water came through slow and steady. Not a flood, not a miracle, just a reliable trickle that would keep 40 head alive through the worst of the heat. Clifton's son, a teenager named Dylan, helped with the trenching. He worked hard and said almost nothing, which Silas respected. When they were done, the 3 of them stood and watched the water run. "How long have you been planning this?" Clifton asked. "Since last winter," Silas said. "Maybe before that. I grew up on this land. I knew what it could be. Your father never—" "No, he didn't." Clifton was quiet for a moment. "I told people at the co-op you were digging up the whole east quarter for nothing," he said. "I said it more than once." Silas nodded. He wasn't going to make it easier. "I was wrong," Clifton said. "You were," Silas said. "But the cattle are fine. That's the part that matters." Pike looked up at both of them as if he found the whole conversation satisfying, then went back to sniffing the new waterline with great seriousness. By September, 4 more properties along the ridge were connected. Informally, voluntarily, Silas running hose to wherever the need was real and the asking was honest. He didn't charge anything. He wasn't keeping score. He had water and other people needed it, and the math was simple enough that he didn't see the point in making it complicated. The town of Harrow Creek was a small place. Word travels fast in small places. By the time the local paper, a 2-page weekly called The Creek Courier, that had been running since 1947 and covered everything from high school volleyball to municipal drainage disputes, ran a piece about the drought and the retired veterans' water system that kept the ridge alive. The story was already the kind of thing people told at the Legion and the coffee shop, and over back fences with a look on their face that meant more than what they were saying. Silas read the article once and put it in a drawer. He didn't do what he'd done for the attention. He'd done it because when he'd come home to this land 3 years ago, older and quieter, and carrying things he'd learned to set down carefully rather than put away, he'd made a decision. He'd decided to understand the land the way his father never had, to learn what it needed and give it that, and to trust that a person who did that kind of patient, unglamorous work would be all right in the end. He hadn't known about the drought. He hadn't built the system for the drought. He'd just been ready. Natalie came back in October. after the rains had finally returned, and the worst of the summer was folded away into memory. She walked the property with him in the late afternoon, the ridge gold with autumn, the cisterns full again, the spring seep running clean and cold at the base of the slope, and she kept stopping to look at things. "This is what you were doing all year," she said finally. "Not a question." "Part of it," he said. Felix told his class about it. His teacher asked him what his grandfather did, and he said, "He catches the water before it leaves." Silas smiled. It was a good way to put it. "How are you sleeping?" Natalie asked, which was the question she always asked, the one that carried everything she didn't say directly. He thought about it. "Better," he said. "Not all the way, but better." She nodded. She had learned over the years not to need a number or a complete answer. She had learned to take better and be grateful for it. Pike ran ahead of them on the trail, looping back every 30 seconds to confirm that everyone was still there, and everything was fine, which was the only job he'd ever taken seriously, and the one he never stopped doing. There was a moment that Silas thought about afterward when people asked him, and they did ask, more than he expected, at the Legion and the coffee shop, and once at a water board meeting in Brandon, where a provincial agricultural officer had invited him to speak, which he'd almost declined, and then hadn't. The moment was from August, just after he'd connected the line to the Dwyer property. He'd been driving home in the late afternoon, the summer light going orange and long across the fields, and he'd stopped the truck on the hill above his own land and just looked at it for a while. He'd been trying to remember, in those first years home, why he'd come back. It hadn't been nostalgia. He was too old for nostalgia. It hadn't been obligation. His father was gone. It had been something simpler than either of those things, something he'd never quite been able to name while he was looking for it. Sitting on that hill in August, watching the water run slow and steady through the overflow channel in the golden evening light, Pike asleep across the passenger seat, with his chin on Silas's thigh, he'd finally understood it. He'd come back because the land was still there. All of it. The spring, the slope, the deep aquifer that Sandra had told him about, the whole patient underground system that had been sitting there through every drought, every hard winter, every year his father had given up on it. It had all been there, waiting. Not for him specifically, just waiting. The way water waits, quietly, underground, certain of itself in a way that nothing else quite manages. He'd come back because something should stay, and he'd learned in 3 years of digging and planning, and being laughed at by men who hadn't thought to look beneath the surface of things, that staying was not the same as standing still. Staying meant knowing the land. Staying meant preparing for what was coming, whether or not you knew exactly what shape it would take. Staying meant being the kind of person who, when the summer turned hard and the dugouts went dry, had somewhere to point a hose. He'd never thought of himself as a generous man. He'd been a soldier, which was a different thing entirely. A thing built around order and precision and the management of force. He'd learned, out there, that you could do generous things for reasons that had nothing to do with generosity. You could share water because you had water and someone else needed it, and the calculation didn't require a philosophy. But he was different now. He thought about Bosnia sometimes, the villages, the quiet after. He thought about what it looked like when infrastructure held, and what it looked like when it didn't, and how much of human dignity was just water and heat, and the ability to feed the people you were responsible for. He'd thought about that in the library in Portage la Prairie, reading about soil drainage, and he'd thought about it on his hands and knees, in the spring mud connecting irrigation fittings, and he'd thought about it on the hill above his land in August when the water was running and Pike was asleep and the light was going. He thought, this is the thing I know how to do. Not war, not the other things. This. Build something before the need arrives. Understand the system. Trust the slope. The waterboard talk went better than he'd expected. He'd prepared notes on graph paper and then barely used them, because once he started talking about the spring seep and the cisterns and the soil permeability tests he'd done, People had questions, real questions, the kind that meant they were already thinking about their own land, their own wells, their own dry summers that were probably coming. He talked for 40 minutes and answered questions for another 30, and afterward, a woman from the provincial agriculture office had shaken his hand and said she'd like to use his property as a demonstration site for rural water management. If he was willing, he was willing. Sandra came back the following spring with 2 university students and set up monitoring equipment on the spring seep. They were measuring recharge rates and aquifer response. Things that had names Silas was still learning. And they set up a little weather station on the ridge that sent data somewhere by satellite. It had a small solar panel and a blinking light that Silas found obscurely comforting on nights when he was up early and went out to the step with Pike to watch the sky come in. Clifton Dwyer had drilled 2 new wells the following autumn, following Sandra's recommendations, and had started building a collection system of his own. He'd asked Silas to look at his plans before he started. Silas had looked at the plans. He'd suggested 3 changes. Clifton had made all 3 without argument. That was different, Silas thought. That was something. Pike had slowed down by the following winter. Not badly, not in a way that required hard decisions yet, but visibly. He slept longer. He moved more carefully on cold mornings, picking his path with an old man's deliberation. He still came to the step before dawn. He still pressed his nose to Silas's forearm when the sleep went bad and the chest went tight. He still ran ahead on the trail and looped back every 30 seconds to confirm that everyone was present and accounted for. But he was grayer now and quieter, and sometimes he simply sat beside Silas and leaned his full weight against his leg for a long time, not asking anything, just being there. Silas sat with him on those evenings and watched the ridge go dark. The spring was running clean under the snow. The cisterns were full. The monitoring equipment blinked its small, patient light on the hill. Harrow Creek was a small town, and small towns have long memories for the things that happen in hard summers. People didn't forget what the ridge had looked like in August, brown and cracked. And they didn't forget whose property had stayed green. They didn't forget the hose running along the fence line to the Dwyer dugout. They didn't talk about it constantly. That wasn't how things were done. But they remembered, and sometimes, at the Legion or in the parking lot of the co-op, someone would nod at Silas in a way that meant more than hello. He always nodded back. He wasn't a man who needed much more than that. The snow came in November, thick and early, blanketing the ridge in white. Pike sat at the back door and watched it fall, with what Silas had come to recognize as his expression of deep personal satisfaction. The dog loved snow the way he loved the spring seep and the morning step and the warm weight of Silas's leg under his chin. Quietly, entirely, without any particular need to explain why, Silas made coffee. He stood at the window and looked at his land. 40 acres of rocky Manitoba ground, a farmhouse that still needed a few things, and a water system that would carry them through whatever came next. He thought about his father, who had not known to look beneath the surface. He thought about the long patience of water. He thought about Bosnia briefly, and then let it go. He put his hand on Pike's head, and Pike leaned into it, and the snow kept falling on the ridge, and the spring ran quiet and cold, and certain beneath all of it, the way it always had, the way it always would.